free commercial there. You know, Apologetics Press has been around now for 47 years. It's a nonprofit organization. All of the money from sales goes back into printing more materials and operating the business. And then this little outfit that my son has put together, it's the same thing. It's not a money-making venture, and so I always feel a little bit uneasy about that. Like, oh yeah, the preacher coming in selling books to make money. That's not what's happening. It's very expensive to print these days, and we're just wanting to get the information out. He has two on child rearing. Any of you who are older and remember what child rearing methods were used by the World War II generation and before, things like the razor strap. Anybody remember what that was, the razor strap? No? How about the switch? See, that's all gone. Remember Johnny Ramsey? He grew up in Sherman, Texas. He had a peach tree out in the backyard. He said they never had a crop on that tree because of his behavior. Anyways, a lot of good material that will help you with your children and grandchildren. All right, we were in Matthew chapter 4. Do you have your Bible? Please flip over there and let's continue on. Just so far, looking at Jesus at age 12, and then Jesus interacting with John the Baptizer, and then Jesus interacting with Satan. See, we're already getting a good feel for his overall tenor, his overall approach. Notice that he didn't pause whenever Satan came after him. He didn't pause and say, come on, Satan, don't be so argumentative. We don't need to fuss and fight over doctrine. You have your views, I have mine. Here, give me a hug. Come on. Isn't that the religious orientation of many people in the religious world? That's not Jesus. Did Jesus carry around bumper stickers, honk if you love me, pass those out to people? Do you not see that all false religion, whether within Christendom or just out in Hinduism, Buddhism, all false religion, since it's not the truth, has to be weighted toward emotion, feeling. Are they completely void of all cognitive material? No, obviously not. They have points that you can even agree with. But because they are a false religion, they naturally have as their basic orientation a more emotional, touchy-feely. It's not depending upon truth and being right about things. But that's not the religion that emanates from the mind of deity. The religion of God, depicted on the pages of our Bibles, and certainly exampled by Jesus. All right, let's keep going. That's chapter 4. Chapter 5, 6, and 7 is the Sermon on the Mount. And look what all could be said about what that says about who Jesus is. Let's go on to, let's go to chapter 12, where we have this grain field incident. Again, you remember the story, the situation. It's Sabbath. That's a key point. He points that out in the very first verse, chapter 12. It's Sabbath. He and his disciples are out apparently away from town. They're passing through a grain field. The disciples are hungry. They reach up and pluck some of the grain and then begin eating it. The Pharisees, the Bible doesn't divulge everything we want to know. What were the Pharisees doing out there? Hiding behind stocks, hoping to catch him doing something wrong? I don't know. That was certainly their attitude. But they confront the situation, and look what they say. Verse 2, when they saw it, they said, behold, your disciples are doing that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath day. Okay, stop right there. Anytime somebody makes an allegation, before you try to justify, step back and say, wait a minute, is that true? See, most commentators take this passage and say, yeah, that was true. They were violating the Sabbath, but hey, he's Jesus. And what the father of situation ethics said back in the early 60s in one of his books, Joseph Fletcher, he was the father of situation ethics in our culture. It's blanketed our civilization. He said that human need rises above such things as doctrinal matters like this. So yeah, the fact they were hungry, that justified them breaking the law. When you need to help a person, that takes precedence over any legal consideration. Well, again, that's not the God of the Bible. God is a God of law. And we live in a society that has convinced the majority of the people that law is bad. It's restrictive, it's negative. But it's not. Even the old law, as detailed and specific as it was, you have passages like Deuteronomy 6 and Deuteronomy 24 that says all this legal material is for our good always. Now, one of the psalmists could say in Psalm 119 over and over and over and over. It's the longest psalm, and if you want to call it a chapter, the longest chapter in the Bible. And it's all about extolling law and how great it is. And Paul could say in Romans chapter 7, verse 12, the law is holy, it is just, and it is good. Is that our attitude about law? Is that the attitude that children have when parents correct children for breaking legitimate rules? No, we think law is mean and restrictive. God has always dealt with human beings through law, beginning with the first two. And it was for their good. Parents can sometimes make mistakes and set up rules and regulations that are probably not good. But God has never done that. Never. All of his laws are awesome and appropriate for us. So, let's challenge their point there. Did they break the law because on Saturday they were hungry and pulled some grain off of those stalks? Well, the answer is no, because the Sabbath law never said that you can't eat for 24 hours. It in fact said you can expend whatever efforts necessary in order to do that. Now, you couldn't pull your combine out there in the field and start harvesting that guy's grain. Exodus 12:16 even says you could do it in a neighbor's field. There wasn't anything unlawful here. Okay, so again, this is another intellectual issue here, so we got to sort through it. That's what Jesus is doing. So look how he handles it. Have you not read what David did when he was hungry? And those with him? How he entered the house of God, ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for those who were with him, but only for the priest. Now again, follow the logic here. He's not saying, okay, David violated the law, he ate when he wasn't supposed to, and so my disciples did, and that's okay. That's not the logic here. He's using, again, a sophisticated logical device. You know, logicians, people like that, medical personnel, they have all these highfalutin terms, don't they? They go to the doctor, oh, well, you've got this. And you're like, well, what's that? Argumentum ad hominem, argument to the man. This is a logical device where a person who is trying to make an argument on some point, and yet they would not make that argument on that point with regard to another person whom they hold up in high regard. Hypocrites. That's what's going on here. Fellas, you want to attack my disciples who actually have not broken the Sabbath. And yet, here's David. And he did. He flat broke the law. Not lawful for him to do. You fellas have any criticism of him? That's the upshot of what Jesus is doing here. They didn't want to accuse David. They held David in high regard, even to that day. And do you remember in Acts chapter 2 when Peter was preaching that sermon and he quoted Psalm 16 and applied it to Christ and said, David wasn't talking about himself in this passage because his tomb is with us to this very day. Remember, he was talking about the Hadean realm and where Jesus had been, and yet he had come out of it. And David didn't come out of it. His body's still here. Think of all the teaching going on there. That we haven't gone straight to heaven. Our spirits are in the Hadean realm and have to reunite with the body before we can then rise to meet Jesus in the air. Now, that's another subject. But the point is, David lived about 1,000 years before Christ. And they're still taking care of his tomb? Have you ever seen a 1,000-year-old grave? There may be some over in Europe or something, but that's unbelievable. Oh, they held David in high regard. They didn't have any criticism of David, and yet he broke the Sabbath law. So his argument is, You fellas don't have any, you're not being consistent. You're accusing my disciples of breaking the law when you approve of David, who actually did so. Now notice, having exposed the hypocrisy, shown their inconsistency, now he turns to the subject. Is it actually a violation of the law if you go out and pluck grain and eat on Sabbath day? Okay, look at his reasoning. This is such unbelievable. Verse 5, or have you not read? By the way, stop right there. That statement, he's made it twice now. Have you fellows not read? Now, here are these Pharisees, right? They're highfalutin figures in Israelite society because of their association with religion and so forth. And you're asking us, have we not read this? Of course we have. We know our Bible. Don't you imagine that was their response? Those were little stinging points to them. Fellows, have you not read this passage? I mean, because the position you're taking suggests you're not as familiar with the Bible as you claim to be. Have you read this passage? I don't see how you could keep from taking that as a jab at them. An unkind jab? No. But intended to prick an honest heart. If a person's honest, that would do them good. If they were humble, they'd step back and say, okay, maybe we haven't thought through this correctly. But we already know what their motive was. They're not interested. The Pharisees were never interested in understanding God's will and applying it. They were motivated by prestige, position, appearance, all of those things. All right, have you not read? Here's the next passage. Have you not read how that on the Sabbath, on Sabbath days, priests in the temple, look at this expression, profane the Sabbath, and yet are guiltless, blameless. I believe profane the Sabbath, that phrase is a figure of speech known as metonymy, where you put the appearance of something for the thing itself. They weren't profaning the Sabbath, but it appeared they were. Because what? They were working. Think of all the things that the priests were required to do on the Sabbath, which entailed a lot of butchering of animals. If you go to a meat packing place and go in and ask the people that run that business, is this work to you all? What would they say? If you one of the regulations of the priests was to bake bread on Saturday. Showbread. Okay, so you come in from your work, you go in, your wife's in the kitchen baking. Haven't you done any work today? See how well that goes. That's work. So the Sabbath law never intended to leave the impression on Saturday you sit down and you don't do nothing. Maybe twiddle your fingers, that's it. You can't do any work. That was not the Sabbath law. There were all kinds of things that had to be done on Saturday that God required that you could define as work. So they've completely misapplied, misunderstood the Sabbath law and used that as a pretext to try to accuse Jesus and his apostles. Again, look at the word guiltless or blameless, depending upon your translation in verse 5. Were they working on Sabbath, those priests? Yes. Required by God to do that? Yes. So that makes them not guilty of breaking the law? Yes. And then look at verse 6. But I say unto you that in this place is, what does your translation have there? King James has one in italics inserted by the translators in hopes of rounding out the meaning for English readers. Sometimes they hit it, sometimes they don't. You know, like adding unknown in 1 Corinthians 14, that was not good. Unknown tongue. That's no doubt contributed to the charismatic movement. He's saying that there is something here going on that's greater than the temple. You guys are fretting about what the priests, what you're allowed to do when the priests were allowed to do it. Do you not see that there is something happening here with my disciples and my presence? This is no doubt a veiled allusion to his identity. Disciples serving God on earth. And you have a problem when there was no problem with the priests serving God on earth on Saturday. Well, at this point, he then quotes another passage. I remember back a number of years ago when our more liberal brethren were really fussing at Churches of Christ, calling us traditional and all of that stuff, and your book, chapter, and verse people, and which, I thought was a compliment, right? They meant it in a derogatory way. And then they always tried to defend some of this stuff. And one of their defenses was, you don't see Jesus and others using scripture that way. What are you talking about? Right here in one passage on one occasion, Jesus is quoted how many passages? From all over the place. Different literary genre, they would say. The Bible answers all error because God, it emanated from an infinite mind who knew what people would argue 2,000 years later. So the answers are there if we'll study it. All right, he says, look at verse 7. This is another stinging rebuke. If you had known what this means. What's he saying? The passage I'm about to quote, you fellows have not grasped, you've not applied it to yourselves. He quotes one of the prophets, Hosea 6:6. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. If you fellows had known what was going on there with Hosea and what was being said to those contemporaries, then you would not have, look at this, condemned the guiltless. Once again, he's claiming, my disciples are guiltless. They've not violated the law. You claiming they have not. And your problem here, see, now really the argument's over. He's already answered their arguments, shown that they're not. But now he's going for their hearts. Now he's saying, fellas, go back and study the prophets. You have the same attitude that Hosea's contemporaries had. Nitpicking people to death, accusing them falsely, instead of wanting to do what the Bible teaches. He's not saying that the sacrifices under the law of Moses were not required. We just want mercy. He's saying God does not want sacrifice only. He also wants love and mercy and compassion associated with that. You fellas could care less about the people around you, the way you're nitpicking them to death. Okay, how do you feel about Jesus having read that, seeing what he was like? You can come on down a couple verses here. There's a fellow on the Sabbath. Look at this. Jesus used this line of argumentation, which is logically tight. It's precise and powerful. He uses it several times when he and others are accused of violating the Sabbath. See, again, if you go read the commentators out here in the denominational world, they're used to being loose about things. So they will say, yeah, Jesus did violate the Sabbath, but it was appropriate for him to do so. And there's times where we have to lay aside God's law. No, the Bible doesn't teach that. Jesus, why would God give people a law and tell them to obey it and then say, but you don't have to? That's illogical in and of itself. This is an instance where a man whose hand was withered, Jesus uses the occasion to respond to their accusation. They say, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And notice the inspired writer even gives us their motive. We can't know what's going on in their hearts and minds unless the Bible tells us to. They're wanting to accuse him, trip him up. And here's how Jesus handles it. What man is there among you who, if he has one sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, would not go rescue it? The law specifically addressed this in Exodus 23, Deuteronomy 22. The old law said that, if you're sitting out on your front porch on Saturday drinking tea, that's a paraphrase, doesn't actually say that, and you see your neighbor's donkey who's broken out of his stall go running down the street in front of your house, don't just sit there and say, oh, not my problem. Get up and go get it. And either bring it back and tie it up until Sabbath is over, or take it on back to him. Another example, the idea of a pit. If you're in a society where your farm animals are your livelihood, if you had an animal fall into a good-sized pit, and if you only have so long to get him out of there, a horse or something like that, and he's going to die. Well, God made provision for all of that. That's not a violation of the Sabbath to expend the necessary effort, which would be considerable, in order to retrieve an endangered animal. That's not a violation of the Sabbath. Now look at Jesus' reasoning here. So you want to tell me, fellas, that even though you yourselves agree that it would be perfectly appropriate for you to go save an endangered dumb animal, you don't think we ought to do the same for humans? If you were in that audience, how would you have felt? If you had a good heart, you'd feel ashamed. Again, their motive was evil, but just the logic of it. Oh yeah, we could do what we need to do to take care of animals, but we can't do that for humans. What kind of cockeyed thinking is that? Jesus used that rationale on a number of occasions, and by the way, it's unanswerable. It's the truth on the matter. Only if a person had a bad heart about all that and didn't want to do right would they not be convinced at that point. Okay, let's go a little further here. What about let's go to right there in chapter 12. Look at this instance here where, look at verse 46 of Matthew 12. He's got a multitude around him, and the parallels indicate that there's so many people there, they're so pressed in that nobody can get in, and his mother, remember now, Mary, and brothers come to the area, and they want to talk to him, but they can't get into him. So they pass the word in to Jesus, and basically say, "Hey, your mother and your siblings are out here and want to see you." And what would you expect Jesus to say? Look at it. Who is my brother or my mother, and who are my brothers? A rhetorical question. And then he puts out his hand, kind of like here are all these people that are packed in there to hear him teach spiritual truths that are critical. And he just kind of says, here they are right here. Here's my mother and my brothers and my sisters. Does that seem kind of cold-hearted, maybe? You know it wasn't. By the way, why was his mother and siblings not in there listening to him teach? What was more important than listening to the Son of God, God on earth in the flesh? And when they stand before God at the end of time, or anybody at that time, they will not be excused by, well, we just didn't know. Well, there was ample evidence that that's who he was. Powerful. It further acquaints us with who Jesus is. Let's go over a couple more chapters. Look at chapter 14. This is an incredible incident. You remember, this is where the parallels are in John 6 and Mark 6. And Jesus is up on land, but the disciples have gotten into a boat and gone out on the sea. And I mean a good one, a good storm comes up. I mean, it's blowing rain in the air. The wind is tossing their boat around. Imagine the turbulence, the boisterousness of the ocean, and they are scared to death. And all of a sudden they see through the mist. Try to imagine this, being out there on that boat, and they see through the mist an apparition, what appears to be someone coming toward them, but they think it's a ghost, a spirit. And look what happens. Verse 27. Jesus speaks to them and says, be cheerful. And look carefully at your translation. All the translations I've looked at have something to the effect of, it is I. But that's not what he said. He said, ego eimi, I am. He did this several times in his life, especially reported through John, but others too. That is a direct allusion back to Exodus 3:14, where Moses at the burning bush hears a voice suddenly, the voice of God booming from heaven, telling him, keep his distance and remove his shoes. And there God commissions him in Exodus 3. Go back to Egypt, enlist the aid of his brother Aaron, and go before Pharaoh and lay before him the demands of the God of heaven. And remember, Moses didn't like this. He makes excuses. And one of his points was, well, what am I going to tell Pharaoh who it is that sent me? What do I say to him? And remember, that's when God said, Exodus 3:14, tell him I am sent you. I've done all the study on this I know to do, and I'm convinced that that's simply a statement of eternality. God was saying, I'm not human like all of you. I'm the eternal God. Didn't have a beginning. I have no ending. I've always been, I always will. He's eternal in nature. It's a direct claim to real deity, not the deities of all the Egyptian gods. Well, over and over in the New Testament, Jesus, he uses that same expression to refer to himself over and over. So here's the disciples scared to death, thinking they're going to die. And Jesus comes up close enough to the boat where they see it's him, and he says, you need to be cheerful, guys. I am. Me phobeste. Stop being afraid. And you know what that leads to? Look at verse 33. They worshiped him. That's what you'd expect. If that claim was true, if he was claiming to be the eternal I am, wouldn't you want to fall down on the ground and worship him? Because that's exactly who he is. And look what they said, the oral confession, the one that we make prior to baptism, which is mandatory to be a Christian. You can't even be a Christian if you do not affirm, orally confess. With Romans 10:9-10 even pinpoints the part of your body that's got to be brought into play, your mouth. Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. That's an affirmation of deity. That's why Paul could say in 1 Timothy 2 that Jesus himself made that good confession. How so? Well, when he stood before Pilate, Pilate essentially said, you claiming to be God? You got it. It's exactly what I'm claiming. Of course, Pilate wasn't impressed by that, but Jesus didn't hesitate to do it. It happened again in John 4 whenever he encountered the woman at the well. Here's a Samaritan, remember, kind of a race. I don't like that terminology because there's one race. We're all part of that. But they had very strong lines of demarcation between Jews and these Samaritans, half-breeds. And Jesus is interacting with her there in John 4, and he makes the point, remember, God's seeking true worshipers. And he's seeking them. He wants people to worship him, which an eternal deity would want because it's right for them. And they must do so in spirit and in truth. And remember her response to that? It's like, well, we realize that the Messiah is coming, the Christ. John throws in there in parentheses, the Christ, same word. When he comes, can't see that there'll be much difference in what you're saying. And he says, look at your translation, John chapter 4. I who speak to you am he. That's not what the Greek has. The Greek has ego eimi, I am. And then a participle, the one speaking to you. My Greek text even has a comma. I am, ego eimi, comma, the one speaking to you. He's telling that woman, I'm him. I'm the Son of God. I'm the Messiah that was to come. The very one standing here speaking to you at this well. Isn't that incredible? It moved her. It moved her. This occurred over and over. So here on this occasion, when the disciples their lives are in peril, they think we're going to die out here. But the I Am steps up to them and says, you need to be cheerful. What are you so afraid of? See, the tendency would be to say, well, I'm afraid of my life being in danger by the storm. Yes, but I'm God. You're afraid of a storm that God himself created and can control? They worshiped him. As well they should have. Go to 11. Okay. Let's go a little further. What about, come over here to chapter 21. Aren't these, just little glimpses? You're familiar with all of them, but when you go back and reassess these, as we do, we're creatures that have to be, we have to have repetition in our lives. Our children desperately need it. They need parents who will tell them the same thing over and over and over. What's right? What's wrong? And we do as adults. And God's done it. The Bible's the most repetitive book on the planet. God wants us to get it. He's given us ample opportunity. Look at chapter 21 where Jesus, look at verse 23. These are the chief priests and the elders of the people. And he's there teaching, and they come up to him, and look at these two questions. By what authority, I'm going to say them the way I think they said them. By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority? I mean, that was certainly the attitude of those the Jewish leadership in the first century. They weren't interested in the truth. There was God in the flesh right there in their midst. And even at his crucifixion, they're clamoring for the Roman attitude. I remember seeing an article in the paper, question and answer article by Billy Graham, it's like 30, 40, 50 years ago, in which somebody said, is it true that the Jews are responsible for crucifying Jesus? No, that's not. That was the Romans, he said. Well, he didn't study his Bible on that either, did he? Pilate wanted to release him. Romans didn't want to do it. They didn't like anything that smacked of disorder and any sort of disturbance, but he was perfectly willing to quell this thing and by the way, release somebody else. And the chief priests of those Pharisees spoke up on that occasion and they egged the people on. Crucify, crucify. They all started saying it too. Of all people on the planet who should have recognized when God came, you would have thought it had been them. Okay, so what happens? You're right, there's a glare there. So what happens? Here's his response, as if he's just kind of being cryptic and playing games with him. Oh, no, he's not. He says, I'll answer your question if you answer mine. Baptism of John, where'd that come from? Is that from heaven? That come from God? Or is that from just men? John just wake up one day and decide, you know what, I think I'm going to start a church. We'll call it the Fifth Ascension Adventist Tabernacle, whatever. All these names are all around us, aren't they? That have come from whence? The mind of men. So is that what John was doing? He decided one day to wake up and, I'm going to start a religion. I think I'm going to take people to water and immerse them as kind of the initiation rite. So all this stuff that John did and taught, and that just kind of came out of himself. He made all that up, like all of the religious stuff going on all around us? Absolutely not. So he presses them with that. Where was John coming from there? Was he simply doing God's will, or was he making all this up himself? So they step back and they say, okay, if we say he came from God, he's going to hit us with, well, why didn't you submit? If we say he made all this up and it was just his own stuff, well, then that's going to get us in trouble with the people because they think he was a prophet. So we're not going to answer you. Well, then neither will I answer you. What did Jesus mean by that? Okay, you won't answer me? Well, nah, I won't answer you. No. He's pointing out, again, logical sophistication. He's pointing out that John got his authority from heaven itself. And if you won't accept him, you're sure not going to accept me. Same source. So here was a masterful way to press the truth, but to silence those who reject the truth. You know, Brother Warren years ago pointed out in a class that I was privileged to sit in about logic, in which he said that logicians have a name for this. It's called a constructive dilemma. It's a very sophisticated logical device by which you silence your enemy, by putting him in a dilemma where he's not willing to take either horn of that. So it shut him down. And in that sense, it served as a lesson to them to try to get them to get the right attitude. And yet at the same time, it affirmed the reality of the fact that he himself, God in the flesh, was standing before them. That didn't impress him. By the way, you could spend a lot of time on this very point with regard to the point that we in Churches of Christ have stressed, rightfully stressed to the religious world around us. You must have authority for what you do in religion. Well, in all of life, for that matter. So do you have a right to go start a church? No. Where would you get authority to do that? Jesus said, I build my church. That's it. Well, could you maybe decide to worship him by, bringing in a mechanical contraption and get the people who can play it really well? I mean, come on. You could give a lot of reasons and arguments as to why that would be great. Many advantages to that. But again, do we have authority? Did God grant us the authority to do that? See, the bulk of the religious world around us does not even have a clue that that's who God is, that God would not allow human beings to do whatever they want to do. He wants what's best for us, so he informs us. Throughout human history, God has instructed and taught and informed, imparted information. Those schools of the prophets weren't just going among the Jews, they were going up to the whole Gentile world. Look at Jonah. God cared about all those people too. So they needed to be told, here's God's view on all of this stuff and how you're behaving. That's the nature of God. Therefore, you and I are not free to just make up stuff in religion because we think it would be great. Think where all this has led it. Praise teams and baby dedication, all kinds of stuff that have swept the church. The best argument I've ever heard from any of them is things like, well, show me in the Bible where that's in the Bible. How about this carpet? And how about these chairs? And how about an exit sign? Show me where that's authorized. So you think that proves that therefore we could just bring in, change worship and do all kinds of things like that? You can't see the difference? As a matter of fact, that is authorized. Absolutely. Because the Bible tells us that we are to assemble as the church even tells us when, first day of the week. And what are we to do? 5 acts of worship. Okay. Now, how do we do that? Well, if we're going to assemble as the church, we have to have a place to assemble, by definition. This is the same as the old preachers who say about God told him Noah to build a boat. Told him it's got to be out of wood, specific kind of wood, dimensions. Is there one word said in Genesis 6 through 9 about hammers, nails, Home Depot? He could have called Home Depot and have them just deliver the wood. He wouldn't have had to gone out in the woods and cut it up. My point to you is, all of that was authorized. In order to do what God tells you to do, the means that are essential to accomplish that are authorized. Therefore, unless you all want to come in and sit in the dark and worship God, I suppose you could make a case that would be authorized. But you could sit in the light too and do what God wants you to do. Well, do we have to have chairs? Well, what's your alternative? Sit on the floor. Who wants to do that? I mean, you would be authorized to worship God that way, but are you not authorized to provide seating for people to worship God? Of course you are. Where's the authority for a bathroom? Not explicitly, but it's implicit. Also entering into this are the laws of the land, which includes things like that. So does the Bible authorize the use of an exit sign in a church building? Our answer to that ought to be absolutely. In the same way that all of the implements that Noah no doubt used were authorized by God, though not explicitly mentioned. So there are no exceptions to that. They want to try to come up with exceptions. Say, well, if you're okay with carpet, then we're okay with instruments. That's the kind of reasoning Satan used in Matthew 4 that we just looked at. Okay. Last point. So what I'm telling you is verses 23 through 27 constitute, if you were to take out a piece of paper and draw a line down the middle and put at the top of one heading from heaven and put at the top of the other heading from men, you can go down and list everything. If you have a Bible study with someone you're trying to get this point across, just ask them to do that. Ask them, what would you put in these two categories? If they don't offer anything, say, well, how about the Lord's Supper? Where would you put that? Is that from heaven or men? What about singing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs? Is that from heaven or from men? Just have them write them in the columns. Well, they're going to see real quick that there's a lot of things that they've put over in the column under heaven that don't belong there because they came from mere men. Is that a 5-minute warning? Okay, good. But by the way, chimes that interrupt preachers, those are not authorized. You know that nurseries are authorized, right? Because in 1 Corinthians 15, not all shall sleep, but all shall be changed. So that's there. Okay, let's see here. One other something else here I thought I wanted to touch on before we call this to quits. 41. I guess it's in the next chapter. Let's just do this one and then we'll save the rest for this evening. Turn to chapter 22 and we can do this one in 4 minutes. Look at chapter 22 of Matthew, verse 41. The Pharisees were gathered. Jesus asked them, notice he initiates this conversation. What think ye of Christ? Whose son is he? You think Jesus just out there just coming up with stuff to talk about, be social, make conversation? They said he's the son of David. What they're saying is that the Christ, the Messiah, Mashiach of the Old Testament that was predicted would be a genetic descendant of David. We find that in 2 Samuel 7, for example, where God gave David a messianic prophecy which applied initially to Solomon, but it then applied to the Messiah, and all the Jews understood it that way. So the Messiah would come, and he would be a genetic descendant of David centuries later. Now look what Jesus does with that. How is it then that David in spirit, he's talking about by inspiration, the Holy Spirit directing him, calls him, that is the Christ, the Messiah, Lord? Oh, where did the Holy Spirit do that? He quotes the passage, Psalm 110, verse 1. The Lord, look at your translation. That first Lord probably is in caps, right? So if you go back to the Psalm, that's the divine name, Yahweh. Said unto my Lord, that's not in caps. If you go back to the Psalm, that's the normal Hebrew word for just like you would use to refer to human lords. The Lord said to my Lord, sit on my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. If David called him Lord, how could he be David's son? They couldn't answer that. Well, this is another one of those somewhat veiled references to the deity of Christ. Jesus was saying that even though David physically preceded the Messiah, how's that? Through Mary. Mary was the physical genetic descendant of David. So David, the Lord's body descended genetically from David. That's how he could be a son. But, by the way, look at Hebrews 10:4-5, where we're told that the body that Jesus inhabited was prepared. That's how it was prepared, through all those generations. But David did not produce the Spirit, that is Jesus, any more than your parents produced who you are. All of us are living in human bodies that were contributed to the construction of by our mother and father. They both contributed DNA that makes our bodies. But they didn't make us, our being, our person, our spirit. That came from God. No doubt at the moment the body was formed when that material came together. I think you can prove that from the Bible. That's when human life begins, in the womb of a mother. So, to conclude, they couldn't answer that. But he was answering it for them and hoping that they would get the point. That the Messiah has come, he's standing before you, and you ought to acknowledge him as the Son of God and render obedience, like all of us. All right, thank you for your kind attention.